season's greeting cards actually started in 1843. Now, it was started by a British entrepreneur. His name was Henry Cole. And he was just so busy with what he was doing that he couldn't get around during the season to pay house calls to everybody, right? And that was the practice at the time, is how you actually, greeted everyone in terms of wish everyone a happy holiday. And so he created the holiday greeting card, right? And he decided to create this as a winter seasonal thing, and which he then mailed to his friends.
Right. And before email, cards had to be actually stamped and mailed.
Right.
And we're very fortunate because today we have Dick here in the studio to talk to us about Christmas stamps.
Fantastic. Hello, Dick.
Hey guys.
Hey.
Hello everyone.
Yes.
How you doing?
Good. How you doing?
Good. So Christmas stamps.
Candy cans for you guys.
Why, thank you.
Hey,
Oh,
thanks,
look at
Luke.
that.
Ah,
There you go.
I love it.
Thanks, Luke.
So 1843 you said, right? For holiday cards. As we know from my very first stamp talk, which seemed a long time ago. 1840, first self-adhesive postage stamps, right? So I guess 1843 was about right. We've now got something we can actually send. Had to wait a long time though before we got real holiday cards and holiday stamps, I should say. So these here are the very first ones, and I know you can't see them on screen, but we're going to show you them in a minute.
Very cool.
Okay, so let's go to the presentation, please. Oh, there we go. So this is a very short history of seasonal stamps from around the world, and that's a little play I did there on a 1969 US stamp that I borrowed from my design. So let's move on to the next one. So are these the first Christmas stamps? Maybe, maybe not. We don't know. They actually say Christmas on them, but they weren't necessarily the very first Christmas stamps. These were issued by Canada in, believe it or not, 1898. These are the ones I was holding up earlier. And it bears the inscription Christmas 1898 or Xmas 1898. But actually the stamp was issued for the inauguration of the Imperial Penny Postage. And of course, being a Brit, when I was a kid at school, we still had some books around that showed the British Empire, albeit long gone by then, but maps of the world with lots of countries coloured in red. And this one actually has at the bottom, I like this one, it says, the little inscription says, "We hold a vaster empire than has been," which is a lovely imperial kind of statement from an ode that was actually written to commemorate Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee a few years earlier. So there was a Canadian member of Parliament, a certain William Mullock, was proposed that this was going to be issued to honour the Prince, meaning the Prince of Wales, or later King Edward VII. But apparently when Queen Victoria found out, she wasn't particularly pleased and said, "Which Prince?" To which Mr. Mullock, quick thinking, said, "Oh, ma'am, the Prince of Peace." So that's how these stamps were added, Christmas 1898, and you can see it's not really the focus of the stamp. So were these the first Christmas stamps? Well, not really. Let's move to the next slide and we can see what probably are the very first Christmas stamps. So British forces in Egypt in the 1930s, they had a stamp that they could use to send postage back, mail back to the families back in the UK. That's the red stamp there. There's a whole series of them from the early to mid 1930s. This one was actually overprinted in 1935 with Christmas 1935 and a slight surcharge there of, on top of the 1 piastre stamp underneath. This really was the first Christmas stamp, but until recently, these stamps were considered to be Christmas seals, not actually real stamps. But then the catalogue companies that collect and maintain the catalogues of stamps issues all over the world said, these really are real honest to goodness postage stamps. So this one now is probably the very first actual Christmas stamp. So that's from 1935. But we had to wait for a long time before we got anything else. So real Christmas stamps. So let's move to the next slide, and I'll show you a selection here of stamps from the 1930s and 40s. This is Austria, 1937, who issued 2 Christmas stamps called Christmas greeting stamps, but they had a vase of roses and some zodiac signs. Not very Christmassy, but it's all right. Brazil, 1939. These are not really Christmas stamps either, although they show the three wise men and the star there, and on the other stamp there is a girl with an angel behind her. But they were actually charity stamps that were issued to collect money for youth charities. Okay, Hungary 1941 there at the top right. Again, not really a Christmas stamp, but this charity in that case was the Soldiers Charity, which was, you raised money for soldiers that were defending Hungary. And then at the bottom now we've got Hungary 1943. Now we've got, honestly, we can say these are really good Christmas topic stamps, right? These are really pertinent to the occasion. And this is the Adoration of the Magi, I guess, in 1943. So the thing is with a lot of these are all one-time issues. They didn't like follow up the next year. So let's move to the next one. Here we have Cuba, 1951, some pretty Christmassy stamps here, poinsettias on them, and bells. It's quite Christmassy. Spain followed up in 1955, and here we have obviously, it says Navidad, so this is a real Christmas stamp with the nativity on there. And then next, one more click. Here's from Australia from 1957. So obviously very Christmassy stamps here. The nice thing about these are really the first ones that weren't just a single issue. So this is where we start seeing every year now, we start seeing Christmas stamps coming out. Okay, so let's look at the first US ones. Here we go. So 1962, first US stamp there on the left, image of two red candles and a wreath and a red ribbon. And then 1963, we have a very interesting stamp, actually, a lot of history behind this one. It looks a little simple stamp. What do we see? We see the Christmas tree, and behind it is the White House. Interestingly, of course, the White House actually has the lights on in the residence. I don't know whether you can see that on the stamp, but if you zoom in, you really can. There's obviously a little bit of sad history to this, because this was 1963. The stamp was designed by Lily Spandorf, who was actually a very renowned painter of scenes around Washington, DC. So it's really one of the first stamps actually painted by a woman. Of course, the stamp was issued on November the 1st in time for the holidays, and of course November the 22nd, JFK assassinated. So, but they had literally billions of these stamps ready to go. So of course they had to issue them, but of course the sad thing was, there was the White House in the background, having lost the president. So there was a bit of history behind these stamps. I always like to call them little pieces of history.
They are.
Let's go on to the next one. The controversy, the 1965 angel. Okay, so this is a very simple design. This angel is actually based on an 1840 iron and copper weather vane that was originally located on the People's United Methodist Church in Newburyport, Massachusetts. Pretty simple, you might say. People actually complained about this because they said you cannot determine the gender of the angel. So we actually start around this point now that the US has no established religion, right? So people would, on one side, would complain, well, you can't, the US Postal Service, being part of the government, can't issue stamps because you're establishing a religion for Christmas. And so the debate started, okay, on both sides of this one. So they sort of said, well, this is a traditional, meaning religious, and then people said, what do you mean religion's dead? You can't say that. So whatever way the Postal Service did, they kind of were failing miserably here. So trying to tread a very fine line between the secular and religious side of it. So let's
separation of church and state.
That's the one, yeah. So let's see how they solved that. Let's move to the next one. In 1966, and you'll see that's on the left. In 67 is the one on the right. This was actually one way around it. So this is called the Classic Art series. So what they did now is they said, oh, look, this is actually the Madonna and Child by the 15th century Flemish artist Hans Memling. And it's actually displayed in the National Gallery of Art in DC. So they said, oh, look, this is just classic art. We just happen to be putting this up for the holidays, So everybody was sort of kind of happy with that to the point where, they said, well, let's do it again next year. We'll just use the same design, slightly bigger. And in fact, that has continued to this day, that a lot of the way they've gotten around it is by using classic art, normally from National Gallery of Art, things that actually hang there. And they said, oh, well, this is the holiday stamp. But really, we're just putting up a picture from the National Gallery of Art. So they're kind of getting around that. Everybody's reasonably happy with that. Let's move on to the next one. Okay, so in 1970, they sort of had the ultimate solution now. So they said, well, we will issue a traditional, i.e. religious themed stamp, keep all you people happy, but we'll also do the contemporary stamps to keep all of the secular people happy. So this was the first set in 1970. As you can see, there's a block of 4 there with children's, old Victorian children's toys on. Still says Christmas. In fact, we actually had to, they later changed it to say season's greetings instead of Christmas on the secular stamps or the contemporary stamps, whatever you like to call it. That was in 1981. In fact, most of the contemporary ones now don't have anything on them. It's just kind of obvious that it's for the holidays, right? So that's where we are now with the US. But of course, you know, we don't just have Christmas, right? We have other holidays to consider. So let's go to the next slide. So yeah, 1996, we saw our first stamps for Hanukkah. Actually, that particular year, that was a joint issue with Israel. So you can see the US stamp on the left and the Israeli stamp in the middle. That was the only year that was done. And thereafter, then there is a Hanukkah stamp that comes out around the beginning of Hanukkah. In the following year, in 1997, we saw our first Kwanzaa stamp. And of course, there are other holidays that have been covered by the US Postal Service. We've actually done the Chinese New Year since 1992. Eid al-Fitr was added in 2001, and then Diwali since 2016. So they're all covered, all the bases are covered. In fact, interestingly, this year, there's actually, I think there's a Hanukkah stamp and a Kwanzaa stamp, but the Christmas stamps were actually used from last year. So it looks like they're not issuing one of everything every year, relying on, you know, existing designs that you can still buy.
Surplus from the year before.
I would imagine so. Yeah, I mean, you got to remember, you know, these are printed by the billion. So you know, so yeah, so other holidays, and of course, this has become one of those things that now, I think even by the 90s, like 190 countries were issuing holiday stamps or Christmas stamps. Wow. So so now, you know, it's if you said, well, go and get a Christmas stamp for every country from this year, you'd end up filling a whole book, because there's just so many countries, apart from the non-Christian countries, that are doing it. So I'm going to leave you with the last slide. Next slide, please. And this, I remember, you know, I was a young lad just starting to collect stamps in the 1960s, and these were the very first Christmas stamps issued by the UK in 1966, so a little behind the times, but of course now they've done them ever since. This was actually a competition that they had for school children up to and including the age of 15, I believe, from which they picked these 2 designs, and the one on the left is Good King Wenceslas from The Christmas Carol, for those of you that know it, who was a Bohemian king who went out for a journey to brave the harsh winter weather to give alms to a poor peasant on the feast of Stephen, which is the 26th, otherwise known in the UK as Boxing Day. Yeah, so that's that. And then obviously we've got the traditional snowman on the right. You'll notice, of course, that British stamps do not need the name of the country on, because we did it first. So it's just the way it works. Everybody else has to put the name of the country on, so we just get the Queen's head and the value, and that's it. So that was one of those things. I think originally the children that designed these stamps got some paltry amount from the post office as the prize for their competition, and then of course, you know, millions of those stamps were made, so they went, excuse me, could we have a little more, please? And eventually, I think the post office relented and said, yeah, here's a slightly bigger.
So Dick, what
Christmas
does the
present.
1/6 mean?
That's 1 shilling and 6pence.
So until 1971, we had traditional currency in the UK. We had the £1. Pound was divided into 20 shillings. The shilling was divided into 12 pence.
Right.
And then in 1971, they cleaned it all up and made it decimal. So you now have 100 pence to a pound.
But we do remember we had a whole talk about that.
That's right. I think
20
you based
shillings,
whole
the
thing
magic
on-
number 20.
Yeah, that's right. So lots of history. So when I grew up as a young lad, you know, obviously we had to deal with pennies and all sorts of weird coins. And then in 1971, it got totally easier. But for the first few years, everybody went mentally converting. from one to the
Yeah.
other.
We still have
So,
weird coins here.
yeah, you do.
These are cool stamps,
They
right?
are.
Really
Are they
enjoy
pretty?
these.
Yeah, they are
Yeah.
pretty. So anyway, that's a little brief, very brief history into
Thank you,
into
Dick.
holiday
It's
stamps.
fascinating.
Thank
All
you.
right,
Very
welcome.
fast.
Fascinating.
Very fast.